I never imagined that my life at 69 would take on a new purpose after my husband passed away. Jack had been gone for 3 years, and since his death the house had been quiet, filled only with echoes and memories. People told me the pain would fade with time, that I'd learn to live with the solitude, but the emptiness only grew deeper, stretching out endlessly. Each day dragged on, and in the stillness, there was no one to share thoughts or feelings with, just the old photo of Jack on my nightstand. One day, when the loneliness had become almost unbearable, I decided to visit a nearby animal shelter. That's where I met Tom, a ginger cat with soft fur and a penetrating gaze. It felt like he could sense my sadness, reaching out to me immediately. In the next kennel, there was Jerry, a gentle Labrador whose kind eyes radiated warmth. Without hesitation, I brought them both home, and suddenly the house was alive again. At first, Tom and Jerry were simply pets, but as time passed, I realized they could sense my emotions. When I cried at night, Tom would quietly curl up on my lap, his gentle purring and soft paws easing the ache in my chest. Jerry would rest his head on my legs, his warm nose and kind eyes expressing more than words ever could. Sometimes, I felt as though Jack had returned, but in a different form. One warm summer evening, I found myself thinking of Jack again, the familiar ache of grief taking hold of me. Sitting on the couch in the living room, I leafed through old photos, the memories making my heart clench with pain. Just then, Jerry approached, sitting down beside me. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine with such depth and empathy that it left me breathless. As if understanding my sorrow, he nuzzled his nose into my hand, and tears streamed down my face. His presence reminded me that I wasn't alone anymore. From that day forward, every morning began the same way, with Tom and Jerry greeting me in bed. Tom would softly purr, waiting for me to scoop him up, while Jerry sat patiently at the bedside, as if guarding my wake-up. They became my loyal companions and closest friends. We spent our days walking through the park, with Tom wandering off a little, his independent nature shining through, and Jerry staying close by, shielding me from the world. The days no longer felt so heavy. These two creatures brought an inexplicable comfort to my life. I no longer feared returning to an empty house, knowing that loving eyes and soothing purrs awaited me. One stormy night, when the winds howled outside, Tom, usually aloof, climbed into my bed and tucked his head under my arm. Jerry joined him, placing his head on my legs as if to reassure me not to be afraid. That moment was a revelation. I realized I'd found something far more profound than companionship. Together we shared a warmth that protected us from life's storms. Caring for them gave my life new meaning. We made breakfast together, enjoyed long walks, watched sunsets, and spent quiet evenings sharing a cup of tea. Even the smallest things, like Tom chasing a ball of yarn or Jerry standing guard at the door, brought joy back into my heart. Their love became the purpose I had been searching for ever since Jack's passing. Looking at them now, I felt nothing but gratitude for the day I decided to bring them home. They were no longer just pets. They were part of my soul, my source of light in a once dark world. That night, as I lay in bed, the house seemed larger than ever. The dim moonlight flickered on the walls, casting blurred shadows. I couldn't sleep, listening to the faint rustle of the wind outside. I noticed movement nearby. Jerry was lying at the edge of the bed, his amber eyes fixed on me. The tension in the room was subtle yet palpable. I couldn't figure out why his gaze unsettled me. It felt deeper than any dog's gaze should be, holding a mystery I couldn't unravel. Unable to resist, I reached out and stroked his soft fur. My fingers trembled slightly, and it felt as though sparks leapt between us. Jerry moved closer, snuggling against my chest, so I could feel his warm breath on my skin. A strange warmth washed over me, both soothing and unsettling. I had always known the bond between humans and animals could be profound, but this was something entirely different. Something I couldn't explain. Over the years, Jerry had become more than just a companion. He had shared in my grief and loneliness, which had echoed like a deafening silence in my life since Jack's passing. But now, it felt as though a new connection was forming. Memories I had buried deep within me began to surface, stirring thoughts I wasn't prepared to confront. From that night on, Jerry seemed to understand me more than ever. He followed me around the house, an invisible guardian, anticipating my every mood and movement. Sometimes I felt his gaze on me, and when I turned to look, he would just sit there, his head tilted slightly, as though silently trying to communicate something I couldn't quite grasp. One night, I woke again to the oppressive silence of the house. Shadows from the trees outside danced across the walls in strange patterns. Jerry was lying next to me, his deep, electric eyes watching me intently. There was a longing and sadness in his gaze that took my breath away. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It felt as though he was holding me in place with his unblinking presence. In that moment, I was struck by fear, not of Jerry, but of the unsettling thoughts that crept into my mind. I knew it wasn't ordinary, and yet I couldn't help but yearn for that subtle feeling that made me lightheaded whenever his paws brushed against my arm or his warm presence lingered beside me. Then came the peculiar nights when Jerry would lie next to me, and it felt as though he were waiting for something, like he understood my unspoken fears and unvoiced thoughts. One night, I had a strange dream. I was sitting by the shore of an immense sea, and Jerry was beside me, gazing out over the dark, restless waves. It felt like he knew I was searching for answers to something vital, but chose not to ask, remaining silent instead. I tried to speak to him in the dream, but no words would come out. What replaced them was a profound wordless despair, as if I had lost something irreplaceable. When I woke, the dream lingered, haunting me like a half-remembered memory from a life I couldn't recall. As I got out of bed, my chest tightened with a loneliness and fear I didn't fully understand. I made myself a cup of tea in the kitchen, hoping to calm my nerves, but my thoughts spun uncontrollably, weaving unsettling patterns that seemed to take shape in the shadows around me. The next morning, I realized I needed a change. Yet as I contemplated this, Jerry was watching me again with that familiar, piercing gaze. There was something more in his eyes than simple affection. It felt like a silent dialogue between us. This unspoken connection became even harder to navigate on dark autumn evenings when the house felt cold and lifeless. My neighbor Annie often noticed the changes in me. She was a perceptive woman, about 5 years older, and her sharp intuition often made me feel exposed, as though she could see through my defenses and into the truths I tried to bury. One evening, she knocked on my door with a plate of freshly baked apple pie. I invited her in and we sat together in the quiet kitchen. Jerry, ever faithful, lay pressed against my leg, offering silent comfort as Annie began talking about her day. Her grandchildren had visited and turned her house upside down. But then her gaze shifted, growing sharper, her tone softer and more cautious. "You look different," she said, not taking her eyes off my teacup. "Something's changed, hasn't it?" My eyes instinctively flicked to Jerry. The weight of her words felt heavy, and I realized the truth they carried. Annie's insight touched on something I'd avoided admitting even to myself. There was a faint shiver in the air, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though I were observing myself from the outside. I saw clearly how my bond with Jerry had deepened into something that went beyond the usual relationship between a woman and her dog. On those nights when I walked with him beside me, his presence brought me warmth and solace that felt almost intimate. And even now, as we sat there, Jerry moved closer, as if he too felt the weight of my thoughts. "Annie," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's just that I feel so lonely sometimes. When Jack passed, I was left completely alone in this big house. Do you know what that's like?" Annie didn't reply immediately, her silence urging me to continue. "I don't know how to explain it, but..." My words faltered, and I couldn't bring myself to fully express the emotions swirling inside me. Annie listened intently, her understanding gaze encouraging me even without words. Perhaps she was remembering her own lonely nights, mourning someone she'd loved and lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm, and her words struck me like thunder. "You can't replace Jack with a dog," she said. "I understand the pain, the need to cling to something, to stop yourself from feeling empty. But it's not the same." Guilt surged through me, hot and unbearable. I knew she was right, but breaking away from the comfort Jerry provided felt impossible. He was the first source of peace I'd known since Jack had gone. I'd clung to his devotion, using it to fill the void in my life. "I've just gotten so used to having him around," I murmured defensively. "It's good to have a friend," Annie replied, her tone gentle yet resolute. "But you need people too. Jack wouldn't want you to hide away from the world." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet house, reflecting on her words. That night I woke to find Jerry lying beside me, his familiar warm gaze fixed on me. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before, a hint of sadness, as if he too understood what I had begun to realize. His role was never to replace Jack, but to provide companionship and comfort in the moments I needed it most. In the days that followed, I forced myself to reconnect with the world. I began visiting old friends, spending more time with Annie, and consciously drawing boundaries in my relationship with Jerry. Though he remained my loyal companion, I reminded myself that he was my friend, not a substitute for the love I had lost. Slowly, the grief that had filled my heart began to ease, making room for new moments of happiness. One day, I gathered my courage and ventured out to the park, the same place Jack and I used to walk together. Everything around me felt frozen, and people bustled past, absorbed in their own lives. That first outing was heavy with sadness, but it also brought a faint sense of hope. It felt like the first step toward healing, and walking soon became part of my routine. I felt the gentle warmth of the sun on my cheek and heard the breeze stirring the treetops. It was during this moment that I met Lisa, a neighbor who always seemed to watch over me with a lawful kind of care. One day she approached me with a polite smile and asked, "How are you doing? We've all been concerned about you." Her words were simple, but they carried genuine kindness. Why hadn't I reached out to her sooner? Perhaps it was my pride, or a fear of being misunderstood, that had held me back. From that point onward, I started talking more with Lisa. She subtly invited me over for tea, and over time I noticed my heart, though slowly, beginning to heal. We talked about books, exchanged stories, and shared memories. Lisa spoke of taking care of her husband, her children, and finding joy in the little things in life. Sometimes we laughed, and at other moments, I felt a lump form in my throat. Yet, it was a real delight to feel connected to the world again. Eventually, I decided to attend a book club Lisa had recommended. During the first few meetings, I felt out of place, as though I didn't belong. But the more I listened to the other women, the more I realized how much we shared. Our worries, happiness, and even heartaches mirrored my own experiences. Jerry noticed the shift in me too. Whenever I returned from a long outing, he would meet me at the door, gazing up at me with his loyal and loving eyes. That unwavering devotion reminded me that there is a kind of silent support in the world, something that doesn't require words or conditions. Sitting next to him, I would run my fingers through his soft fur, marveling at how deeply he seemed to understand me, often better than anyone else. Still, I made an effort to open up more, particularly with my family. They had seen me as withdrawn and lonely, aware of how grief often consumed me. I realized then that while Jerry was my comfort, he was never meant to be my sole support. When I shared my struggles, my family listened, held me close, and offered the kind of reassurance I had needed all along. I saw clearly that they had always been there, simply waiting for me to allow them in. Looking back, I understand how easily loneliness can lead us to dark places, compelling us to seek solace in places where it doesn't truly belong. But I've also learned that genuine connection isn't just about the bond between a person and a faithful pet. It's about the relationships we build with the people who stand by us during our hardest moments. As time went on, life gradually felt a bit lighter. Every evening, I still sat beside Jerry, half inclined, stroking his soft ears and whispering words of gratitude. "You've been such a wonderful dog," I would tell him, feeling the warmth of his devoted gaze as it comforted my heart. Jerry embodied a kind of love, pure, endless, and sincere, that I know will stay with me forever. At the same time, I've come to appreciate the unique power of human connection. We need each other. It is only together that we can navigate grief, rediscover joy, and feel truly uplifted again.